Welcome to our June webinar, the Agile Organization, Transforming to an Agile Organization. We welcome each of you here today. I am the speaker today, Linda Nelson. I'm the ICOR president, and I serve on the U.S. TAG as an expert on the ISO 22316 Standard Organizational Resilience Principles and Attributes. I also serve as the author of ICOR's new Certified Organizational Resilience Education and Certification Program. Our objective today is to gain an understanding of what makes Agile organizations different from non-Agile organizations, and really to help convince you that Agile is better. If you've been on our webinars before, you're aware that the recording will be available on the ICOR webinar page, usually by Friday, so in about 2 days. If you have questions, please use the questions button. There is a lot of content today, so my guess is that the questions will be answered in an email after the webinar to all of the attendees. We will share the questions as well as the answers. And attendees who attend at least 30 minutes will also receive a certificate of attendance for CEU purposes. So let's go ahead and get started. I always like to start with some kind of a definition of what it is that we're talking about. And in this case, there's not really an accepted global definition of what is an Agile organization. I grabbed the one from Talent Lift because I liked it the best, but there are other ones that are just as good. In this case, we're talking about a term that's applied to organizations that are quick in responding to changes in the marketplace or environment. An Agile organization is really focused on its customers' needs, and that helps to drive customized rather than standardized offerings. A highly Agile organization also uses advanced processes, tools, and training, which enables them to have successful reactions to the emergence of new competitors, rapid advancements in technology, and sudden shifts, for example, in overall market conditions. And they commonly thrive in non-hierarchical organizations without a single point of control. And if you've listened to other of our ICOR webinars where we've talked about organizational resilience, what I'm hoping is that you will see some overlap between what we have identified as being necessary to be more resilient, as well as some crossover between what Agile organizations also are expected to demonstrate. And this is really because managing change and being agile is a key component of being more resilient. So moving on to the topic of change. Change is hard, but not changing is fatal. So I've used this slide before, but I've added a little note here saying that change that's good isn't as hard as change that's bad. And I'm sure if you consider this, you'll agree that, and when you're thinking about change within an organizational context, that people enjoy working in organizations where change is good. So one of the things I always try to talk about is, why are we discussing this? What's the purpose for this talk? And that's really because rapidly changing business conditions dictate that organizations need to be more flexible, and that rapid pace of change continues to get faster and faster, and it's becoming more intense. And I don't know if anybody thinks it's going to become less so. So if you're not able to manage change, you better start figuring out how to do it. We all have understood the impact of digitization, increased globalization. The companies are working well beyond their traditional borders, and this idea of short-term thinking. I never would have thought that short-term thinking would actually be something that was being encouraged versus always having your long-range plan. But because of all this, there is a need for far greater organizational responsiveness as well as continuous and systematic innovation, not just episodic, but systematic. And we need to do more of a fundamental rethink about looking at corporate structures that are typically dominated by functional silos and hierarchy. And this, again, is a key theme. And we're going to not be talking a lot about structure today, but it is going to be part of the conversation. So how do you become agile? How do you be agile? And this is where there is no cookie cutter approach. Every organization needs to find its own path, and they need to make smart decisions about how they're going to apply agile structures, processes, and working. And they might be selective about it, not do it for the entire organization. And we'll talk a little bit about why. Remembering that agile is not a one-size-fits-all, and it's just as important to think about being agile as it is about doing agile. And because of all the changes in digital technologies, we need to be able to take advantage of those. And we can't really do that unless we start thinking about our resources and our processes and priorities in a really different way. And like any other thing, when you're talking about making your organization or implementing any kind of a change, it's often deployed by starting with a small multidisciplinary team and doing something that's very focused and in order to innovate, generate new value, and help support change. But starting in a small manner of someplace where you think you could be successful or where it's most required. So let's start with our first poll. I'm a big advocate of polls. So I just wanted to get kind of a feeler, which is to what level has your organization embraced Agile? So you have some choices, are you fully agile? Are you implementing in some parts of your organization? Are we talking about it, something we want to consider in the future? If the agile question mark is, I don't even know what we're talking about. And I don't think the other is supposed to be there. So if you could ignore the other, that would be great. Looks like a little bit over half of you have voted. We'll keep it open for another 10 seconds or so. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results. This is really interesting. I'm actually pleased that there's some of you that aren't really sure about what we're talking about, but I'm also really pleased that 70% of you are implementing it in some parts of the organization. And I would really encourage you, if you could please, whether you use the questions button or whether you send me an email, I would love to be able to hear how you're implementing it and how it's being done, how successful you are, and things like that. Because what we're trying to do is to put together some case studies, even if we don't identify the company name, just to give people some examples about how they might go about doing this. So thank you for participating in the poll. So a lot of our webinar today is based on work done by McKinsey and Associates, and we will share all of the links to all the different articles and research at the end of the webinar. But they put together a survey, and it's part of their organizational health index that they run. And this is a really strong measure of how to determine how healthy your organization is and how you can improve that health. And so in this study that they did, 2/3 of the respondents said that their sectors are characterized by rapid change. And because of that, they need to be able to demonstrate agility. So if you're in a rapidly changing business sector or even a part of your business within your own company that one part of it's maybe seeing more change than others, this is probably going to be some place that you're going to want to be more agile maybe than in other parts of your organization. And this is why you see agile being implemented in IT so often, because there's such rapid change there. 3/4 of respondents said that agility ranks as a high strategic priority within their own business units or performance units. And they're using the word performance units here purposefully because these are cross-functional teams, and so they're no longer called business units. 81% of the respondents in agile units, so the people that are actually working within what they've identified as agile units, report a moderate or a significant increase in their overall performance since their transformations began. So they're seeing an immediate benefit to doing so. And then what they also saw was, on average, respondents that are working in what are considered more agile units are 1.5 times more likely than others to report financial outperformance relative to their peers. And they're 1.7 times more likely to report outperforming their peers in non-financial measures. And just to summarize, the more volatile or the more change that your organization has, you're more likely to be pursuing agile transformation. So companies that are very stable, that don't have a lot of change, or parts of companies that don't have a lot of change, are probably less likely to be looking at agile practices. Talent Lift also provides some general traits of agile organizations. And what you're going to see is a real overlap here in some of the general traits of more resilient organizations. But they're made up of skillful, self-aware individuals who are also great team players. Their leaders inspire others without losing the cohesion within the entire system. Their organization is based on continuous learning. They use an open communication style, such as collaboration and sharing. And I'm just looking at these and just saying, these are really key attributes of more resilient organizations as well. And they are focusing on that long-term business value. Another line of, I don't want to say line of business, but discipline is organizational development. And this is something that is sometimes newer in the marketplace, and you're seeing it in more universities and things. But organizational development also compares itself to Agile, and they're talking about organizations needing to be open systems, so systems that are constantly interacting and adapting with their environment. And so organizational development works with organizations at a systemic level and not just with some parts of the organization. So it's very much part of the entire organization. And when they look at how to adopt agile methods, they say that there's sometimes some challenges, that it requires a shift in how the organization and management practices, in a shift in those practices. So we're going to be talking about how you need to move from a mechanistic organization to a more organic one, or at least an effective mix of both, and relinquishing that command and control style to a collaborative style. And we had a webinar recently where we were talking about the incident response structure, and this idea that especially if you're in risk management, business continuity management, disaster recovery, or anything that, emergency management, anything that has to do with managing risk and managing an incident, information security and your IT, DR things, that we are so much set up in a command and control style, and especially for being able to make quick decisions and being able to be collaborative, command and control is just not the best structure for that. And the challenge really is that so many of us have been taught that we need to use incident response system. And I'd advocate in that specific area that you can still use the incident response system, but you need to enable your teams to be able to make decisions effectively and independently and collaboratively. So just moving to that more collaborative style within that system, if that's a system that you've adopted. They also talk about looking at your reward system. So they're highly involved in HR, and that your reward systems need to promote teamwork and retaining people. And sometimes this creates some challenges because you're asking organizations to reorganize themselves as also to reorganize their teams. And teams need to be trained and coached to perform as self-organized teams in order to learn and adapt to the environment. And customer collaboration, if you're trying to meet customer needs, you need to be able to collaborate them. And this requires the team to build an atmosphere of trust and communication between them and their customers. And just reminding you that sometimes it's difficult to get customers on board to participate actively. And one of the other challenges is that if you're moving to Agile, companies that are invested in CMM practices have to give up some of those because they're very rigid and they're not very agile. And if you want teams to work in new methods, you have to come up with new ways to evaluate performance. So we face an agility challenge. Agile companies regularly rethink, and if necessary, they redesign their structures, their governance systems, or their mechanisms, as well as their processes to strike a balance between speed and agility. So while Agile companies seem to share a few behavioral norms, such as a bias for action and the free flow of information, other norms are also they vary due to the nature of the company. And there isn't, really a specific recipe for adopting a high-performing culture. So it's about instilling the right kinds of behavior for how we do things around here. And it has to do with, in order to put change in place, you have to change your behavioral norms, and that takes some time. And understanding what behaviors the organization's looking for in order to really implement, how we do things around here. So this sharing of behavioral norms is definitely tied to free flow of information. And the clearer and more widely adopted these behaviors are throughout the organization, the easier it is to make some of those changes. So the question is agility and stability a paradox? So when you're stable, you want to be reliable and efficient, versus when you're agile, you want to be nimble and adaptive. So these are just some pictures that I thought were kind of funny about that what could be a paradox in some reasons. But the question, really the answer here is that to survive and thrive in today's competitive and constantly changing world, it needs to be both. You need to be both stable and agile. Excuse me. And so you need to design your organizations to drive both speed and to create stability. So I talked earlier about McKinsey's Organizational Health Index, and this is considered to be the largest database in the world that measures how companies run themselves. And I want to talk briefly about each of these four categories. And I'm going to start with bureaucracy on the bottom right. The two measurements are your dynamic capability, with weak being at the bottom and strong being at the top, and then having a stable backbone, with, of course, strong being to the right and weak being to the left. In a bureaucracy, you tend to be risk averse, efficient, slow, bureaucratic, have some standard ways of working, maybe be siloed. There's an escalation for decision making, but you're also reliable. You're centralized and you're established. So there's some positives and some negatives with being a bureaucracy. Trapped is probably the place you don't want to be, because you have both a weak backbone as well as weak dynamics. You don't have a very good capability for change. So you tend to be uncoordinated, stuck. You feel like you're building empires, fighting fires. You've got local tribes. There's finger pointing. People are under attack. Everything's very rigid. You tend to talk about politics and protecting your turf. And in this case, they've got quotes around startup, because they're using some of the attributes of a startup, but it isn't meant to be for a startup company. However, it is a startup company might be, have really strong ability to change, but be very weak with their stable backup or backbone. It can be chaotic, but can also be creative. It can be frenetic and a free-for-all, but people can, work ad hoc. There's not a lot of boundaries. And sometimes you might feel like you're reinventing the wheel because you don't have that stable backbone, which also helps with this, which also is impacted by having a constantly shifting focus and being more unpredictable. In the Agile box, it means that you're very strong with managing change, and you've also got a really stable backbone. So we're talking about it's not either or, it's and. And the description of an Agile organization is that you're quick to mobilize, you're nimble, you're collaborative, it's easy to get things done, you're responsive. There's a free flow of information. There's quick decision making. You're empowered to act. And in this case, they even use the word resilient, and you have an ability to learn from failures. And what they found is that companies that consider themselves agile have been in the 70% chance of being ranked in the top quartile by organizational health. And that's a far higher proportion than found among other companies that focused only on either being agile or having a stable backbone. But in reminding you that organizational health is itself a predictor of strong financial performance, so there's a direct tie between those. So I'd like to do our next poll, and I'd like you just to choose which behavior category best describes your organization. Are you more bureaucratic? Do you feel trapped? Do you feel more like a startup? Or are you more agile? All right, about half of you voted, so we'll give you a couple more seconds. All right, I'm going to close the poll. I found this really, really interesting that, almost evenly between trapped, startup, and agile. And but more than half of you are in a bureaucracy, and that's not surprising. What is surprising is that difference kind of between the percentage of you that felt like you were working on agile initiatives and the number of you that feel truly fully agile. So you're working on it, but you don't feel fully there yet. And part of that reason is probably because you're still part of a bureaucracy, and it's really hard to change a bureaucracy. And in some industries, a bureaucracy is actually appropriate. So it's really interesting. Thank you for sharing. So let's talk some more about the power of and. Why do established companies struggle to become more agile? And this is no small part of the difficulty because they think that there's a trade-off between, the assumptions that the executives have to choose between this much needed speed and flexibility on the one hand, and then this idea of being stable and fixed on the other hand. And startups are notoriously well known for acting quickly, but then they grow beyond a certain point. It's really because they don't have that structure in place. It's hard to maintain that early momentum. And also, organizations that are more bureaucratic tend to struggle with making decisions and being more agile. So it's this balance of the two. So what we want to talk about next is you have to have structures in place, governance arrangements, and processes that are relatively unchanging. This is the kind of the fixed backbone of your organization. And then you've got the looser and more dynamic elements that can be adapted quickly to new challenges and opportunities. And we're going to give an example of this, but I actually talk about this a lot. I used back when, being a mother, for example, and saying, here's the box where you can behave. And this is where where we expect you to be. But within that box, you can do whatever you want. And that's kind of what we're talking about here. We're talking, the McKinsey gives a really great example, the fact that let's look at our smartphones. They have the ability to be both stable and dynamic. The smartphone is really helpful because of both of their design as well as their functionality. So you've got your hardware system and your operating system that forms that stable foundation. That's your primary structure of your home. And then this also helps provide the governance for that. And you've got a process, you've got a language, you've got all sorts of other things. Within the organization itself, you're going to be looking at, how is your organization structured, who and how who makes decisions, how are those decisions made, how are resources allocated, and how do you give oversight to performance. And there's also standard language and shared performance metrics across the teams. And then what brings your agility piece in, the dynamic piece in, is this having space for new apps. So your phone comes with apps, so you can download apps. And this really changes, and you're building on that stable foundation about how you want to be. So you've got, your team changer app, the ability to set up and dissolve teams and reform them. Your peer review, being able to offer quick feedback to a colleague. Having team targets where you can set and reset metrics and targets at regular intervals, something like your milestones. You've got your resource allocator where you assign people and money to project teams. You've got your process builder where you can quickly preview standard setup and processes and stack that in a modular way. You've got your decision convener, so somebody who is working to cross-functionally with the leaders across and help debate decisions. And you've got your decision delegator. Who are you going to delegate decisions to in real time? So I really liked this picture and this example of how you combine a stable backbone with being dynamic. Moving on to that, there's those three core organizational areas of focus. We're talking about structure first. So moving away from this mechanistic, the org chart view, and we're going to talk a little more about this, and moving towards having teams that cut across formal structures. Coca-Cola is an example of a company that does this. They have an organizational structure that's integrated mostly with their dominant geographic units based on region and countries, and that's their primary access. Then they have a second dimension that's around their few strong central functions like marketing, finance, and HR. And this is really pretty much their largely unchanging and basic operating model. And then they make adjustments to their specifics as new issues and opportunities arise. But the essence of that matrix, that structure piece, with the geographic units being their primary axis, is really what's helped them to be very stable and really virtually unchanged for many years. When you're looking at governance, it's like, how do you establish both stable and dynamic elements in making decisions? So you've got those type 1 decisions where stakes are very high. Who's going to make those decisions? The type 2 decisions are those frequent decisions that require that cross-unit dialogue and collaboration. And these are the topics that most often hinder agility because you don't have a process in place to manage those decisions that need to be made quickly and often. And successful organizations define which decisions are best made in committee and which can be delegated to direct reports and those closest to the action. They've got clear charters and responsibilities. And remember this because we're going to be talking more about this in a little bit. And this idea of avoidance of overlapping roles is also really important. Lastly, you've got your type 3 decisions. And these are really your decisions that should be parsed into smaller ones and just delegated as far down as possible. The third core organizational area of focus is on process. And much as Agile companies underpin this idea of, having this degree of stability in their structure and governance, when they create that stable backbone, they also need to create it for their processes. So understanding what are your signature processes? How do you get an idea to market, your market to order, and your order to cash? Where is it that your organization excels? And that you can standardize those processes. And those are the things that are harder for competitors to replicate. So when everyone understands how these key tasks are performed, who does what and how, especially in the case of new initiatives, this allows you to drive the timetable for your new investment, that organizations can move more quickly by redeploying people and resources across units, across countries, and across businesses, and everybody must speak the same language. And the key takeaway here is that when standardization of processes is lacking, agility suffers. This is where a lot of organizations drop the ball. Deloitte has put together, I think, a pretty decent chart that was published by Josh Bernson, and looking at some of the trends that are coming that are disruptive and what they might mean for you in the future. And some of these things I believe are actually today. I might argue that it's 2019. It's only 2 years since Deloitte published this, but I actually think some of these things are happening today. Where 57% of you still said you were hierarchical, the other 43 did not. You were somewhere else. So your organizational structure, moving to projects, to squads, to teams, to shared services, where your teams and projects move from being formed slowly to being able to assemble and stop quickly. And again, I see a lot of relevance for this in risk management, business continuity, and all the areas that manage risk, especially with your job roles, where you're based less on job descriptions, job levels, and job titles. Instead, you're working on your latest assignment, your tasks. Where is your expertise? What role do you play? Where we're moving from managers owning teams and people's careers to managers who manage projects and sponsor people. Where careers where your jobs aren't owned by your manager. Some of you might actually appreciate that, but that jobs are more open in a transparent marketplace, where people under flexibility and space, where people are no longer assigned jobs by management, but people are sought out based on their skills, their work on and ability to work on multiple projects. Again, where people are rewarded by their outcomes, their reputation, and their sponsorship instead of by their level, tenure, experience. And the culture today, I think companies are still striving today to be inclusive, to have sustainability and diversity. I'm not saying get rid of those things, and I don't think that's what Deloitte is saying either, but it's saying moving from there, hopefully you already have that in place, and now moving more towards citizenship, collective thinking, and shared values. wanted to share one anecdote here. In the last couple of weeks, I have a daughter who works for an insurance company in the Chicago area. And they recently decided, her boss decided that they needed to put together the processes that they have in their Chicago offices into their Australian offices. And so they put out this job in this transparent marketplace and said, we're looking for some people that have these skill sets and who would be interested in doing a 2-year project in Australia. And so they've put together a team of 4 people that come within the main, they're still in the same line of business because they're people that are doing this for their jobs, but they're not all from the quote, they're not all working for the same manager, and they're doing different things within that area. And so just by posting this in a transparent marketplace, they got together and they have a team, and they think this will be running before the end of the year. They're going to be launching it. So it's relatively a quick thing. And so all of a sudden, the manager is sponsoring these people. They're still working 50% for their Chicago manager, but they're also working for the sponsor underneath this other team. So we talked about the importance of moving from machines to living organisms, and this is kind of a picture that McKinsey's put together, where that might look very familiar to you if you're bureaucratic. You've got that top-down hierarchy. You've got people that are doing very specific things in very specific areas, and they're very siloed. And if you're trying to move to organizations that work more as organisms, you know, instead of a triangle, you've got more of a circle. You've got leadership in the middle versus at the top. You've got teams that are built around this end-to-end accountability. And you've got boxes and lines that are less important and more focused on the action. And this allows you to be more quick, you know, to manage change and you have flexible resources. I'm sure you all are still fighting for your budgets and to get the resources that you need for your area. Imagine if you worked in a company where the resources were there and that you had to advocate for them with cross-functional teams that are represented here by the different colors within those circles versus them being all the same color on the left. So I want you to take a second. We're going to talk about 18 practices for organizational agility. And what I would like you to do is to just, with a pencil or whatever you want to do, and I'll go back to pencil and paper, but just make a note of how many of these practices that you see your organization doing. Because even though you might not be purposefully trying to be agile or implement the agile organization, there's most likely a lot of these things that your organization is already doing that you can leverage and build on to the things that you might not be doing. So we're going to talk about 18 of these things. So I'd like you to kind of just keep a tally of how many of these 18. You can even give yourself half points if you want, if you think that you're partially there. So this agility practice of shared vision and purpose, you've heard me talk about this a lot. You've heard ICOR talk about this a lot, where people feel personally, emotionally invested in their work and that they know that they serve a common purpose. And when that strategic direction is refined, it's a collective effort that includes the people who drive the work. You've got actionable strategic guidance. Daily work is guided by concrete outcomes that help advance the organization's strategy. And leaders and peers provide frequent feedback and coaching. And this enables people to work more autonomously towards their team outcomes. You're able to sense and seize opportunities. I just did a webinar this year talking about forecasting and really looking ahead to seeing what's out there. This is really, really important aspect of being a more resilient organization. And if you're not looking ahead, you're not going to be very agile. So you've got an intentional way to proactively watch for and act upon changes, both to customer preferences as well as in your external environment. And you're actively using customer insights to shape, pilot, launch, and iterate on new initiatives and business models. You've got some flexible resource allocation, as I mentioned earlier. You've got a systematic system in place or a process in place to regularly evaluate the progress of business initiatives and decide whether to ramp them up or shut them down. And key resources such as high-performing individuals, leadership time, we all fight for that, are deployed and redeployed between initiatives as their performance or relative priorities changes. And this idea of action-oriented decision architecture, there's a lot of content here. but just, your decision-making process and norms are clear and they're widely followed. If a decision maker can't attend a meeting, they provide their input in advance, and then they accept the outcome of the decision that's made. People closest to where the work happens have the authority to make decisions. This is so very important, especially in the crisis management area. If your roles or your responsibilities are unclear in any way, people proactively resolve them to try to make sure that they understand them. And you're looking at a performance unit structure that needs to be adapted or scaled to meet changing needs. You're able to do that quickly. Decisions are made quickly for that. You've got fit for purpose accountable cells. So people are working in small self-managing teams that are accountable to the end-to-end work on a specific process or service. And then your teams form and dissolve as strategic priorities change. Just, this team that's going to Australia is going to go back, and probably do something similar or go back to what they were doing before they left, or based on how the company's changed in those 2 years. But you're actively, ramping up and ramping down. You've got active partnerships in an ecosystem, so people can work hands-on and day-to-day with their customers. You've got flexible models for partnering with external parties as well. You've got an open physical and virtual environment where the work environment is purposefully designed so that people can communicate and collaborate. And it's also purposefully designed so that people can do their jobs effectively. You can choose to sit based on your needs and preferences. One of my daughters talks about how when she's doing a certain type of work, she sits more in a cubicle type environment. And when she's doing other work, she's sitting in a wide open space with her team members. Depends on what she's doing. If you only have one way of being able to work in your company, you're not going to be able to be as productive. And looking at standardized ways of working, there's some things, part of that stable backbone, that need to be consistent. And this is going to be completely important for organizations that are more regulated, where you're dealing with more financial issues as well. Looking at this performance orientation, where your individuals, teams, and business or units are evaluated using cross-functional business metrics and targets. So everybody who's part of a team is evaluated the same way. Wouldn't that be nice? Where you've got this rapid iteration and experimentation, where you've got innovations that are iteratively developed. And this really, using that IT Agile model, probably makes the most sense here, to be copying that and using that and leveraging that as well, especially when you're looking at also new products and services. Making sure that you've got some transparency with your information. We talked about this importance of communications, that people across all the unit have access to data and unfiltered data, and that people can share ideas based on the results of their work. Where you've got continuous learning, where you've got dedicated time. Can you imagine that? Dedicated time to look for ways to improve your business process and the way you work. And then you also have structured processes and tools. Maybe you look at postmortems, lessons learned. Maybe you've got a knowledge marketplace that enable people to learn freely from each other, as well as on-the-job successes and failures. That would mean you'd have to actually talk about those. Where you've got a shared and servant leadership, where leaders inspire people to act in team-oriented ways, and they're actively involved in strategic and organizational decisions that affect them and their work, and that leaders influence others through coaching and development rather than just through that hierarchical authority, enabling people with the most relevant capabilities for the work at hand to lead. You also need to have a cohesive community where people across all levels and teams trust each other. We're going back to some culture things here again. This is where it's really hard to be agile if you don't have a culture that allows you to do that. And you've got a common culture where, it's based through fit-based recruitment and positive peer pressure rather than rules, procedures, and hierarchy. You've got an ability to be entrepreneurial, where you can actively identify and pursue opportunities, whether it's through new initiatives, knowledge, and skills. And the people that work with you have an intrinsic passion for their work, and they really aim to perform beyond expectations. Again, very cultural here. We're going to be talking about people understanding their roles, and here we're talking about role mobility, where people can move vertically and horizontally between roles and teams based on their personal development goals, that is, their knowledge, skills, and networks they want to build. And the organization also maintains an open talent marketplace where available roles, tasks, and or projects are clearly communicated, like the one I talked about a few minutes ago. And then where you've got technology systems and tools, you've got cross-functional teams of business and technology where you're collaborating. How often do you hear between business continuity and IT that they're siloed and they don't talk to each other? I mean, you need cross-functional teams where the business and technology are collaborating all the time, because technology needs to be seamlessly integrated with those key processes and make sure that they can be responsible to your changing needs, as well as the changing technology that's happening all the time. So let's take our next poll, and this is where I really wanted to ask you is, how many of these do you think your organization is exhibiting? Because if your organization is successful, it's going to be exhibiting some of those things. And if this is something that you want to start having conversations for with your company, it would be kind of nice to say, look at all the things that we're really doing well and that we could be considered agile in, or where you've already systematically implemented some agile practices. And these are the activities that the practices that we could start to add those to. So it looks like just about everyone has voted. I'm going to go ahead and close this and share the results. It's interesting that 63% of you have already, you're almost halfway there, somewhere between a third and halfway there. Not surprising that 16% of you, your companies are only doing a few of those things, and that would make sense since that about same percentage didn't have their organization being agile at all. And then about 5% of you feel like you're doing a lot of those, and that would make sense if you are the organizations that are currently working on those initiatives. The next thing we're going to talk about is the 5 trademarks. And so you're going to notice that those practices are being referenced here in the column on the right. And so we're going to be talking more at a high level on how those practices might be bundled. And while each trademark has intrinsic value, what McKinsey is saying is that true agility comes only when all 5 are in place and working together. So we understand that companies need to start somewhere, but it needs to be an organic system in order for this to work. So on the strategy side, we've got, you've got kind of a North Star embodied across the organization. People really know what the purpose of the organization is. They're able to sense and seize opportunities. You've got some flexible resource allocation, and you've got actionable strategic guidance. Leadership is providing leadership. So you're trying to move from an environment of scarcity where your success is seen as capturing value from competitors, customers, and suppliers, to recognizing you've got an abundance of opportunities and resources available to you, and that you can succeed by co-creating that value with and for all of your stakeholders. On the structure side, we're kind of looking from a mindset shift where you're moving from where people need to be directed and managed, otherwise they won't know what to do. I've worked for a boss like that in my past life. I was allowed to make decisions on my own. I didn't stay there very long, but that type of leadership is tough. And but the belief is that if you don't do that, that people are going to look out for themselves, that there's going to be chaos. Instead, we're looking to move to where people are given clear responsibility and authority, that they're going to be highly engaged. They'll take care of each other and they'll figure out ingenious solutions and will deliver exceptional results. And this can really only happen if you've got more of a clear, flat structure where you've got clear, accountable roles, there's hands-on governance, you've got some robust communities of practice, you've got active partnerships, you've got an open physical and virtual environment, and you've got those fit-for-purpose accountable cells. So let's drill down a little bit more on that network of empowered teams. So here you've got cross-functional teams, and you might use this for a product development or product launch. And these teams are typically connected and integrated based on their expertise from different levels of the organization and how they contribute to that product launch. You also might have self-managing teams, and this might be something you see in customer service or sales or manufacturing. These are usually, standalone, repetitive, and these are relatively stable teams that they're going to be working against key performance indicators, and they're relatively stable type of teams. And then you've got the flow to work pools, where you've got pools of individuals staffed to do different tasks full time based on a priority of needs, and these tasks can vary from hours to months. These are usually, again, individual or standalone and repetitive, things like corporate services like you might see in HR and legal, etc. The third trademark has to do with process. So how do you make rapid decision and learning cycles? So looking at this rapid iteration experimentation, you've got standardized ways of working, you've got performance orientation, you've got information transparency, continuous learning, and action-oriented decision making. So you're really moving from delivering the right outcome that most senior and experienced individuals must define where we're going and the detailed plans to get there and how to minimize risk along the way. And I like the way that we're using risk here too. That the fact that we live in a constantly evolving environment and we don't know exactly what the future holds, and that the best way to minimize risk and to succeed is to embrace uncertainty and be the quickest and most productive in trying new things. A whole different way of looking at it. The fourth trademark is your people, that you've got a dynamic people model that ignites passion. You've got a cohesive community. You've got shared and servant leadership, an entrepreneurial drive, and you've got role mobility. So you're moving from, in order to achieve desired outcomes, leaders need to control and direct their work by constantly specifying tasks and steering the work of their employees. Again, more of the micromanager type of thing, to having effective leaders who empower employees to take full ownership, confident they'll drive the organization towards fulfilling its purpose and value. This can be really scary for people, especially if you're one of those leaders who feels like they need to control and direct work. Lastly, a trademark is your technology, and we all know that you've got evolving technology, architecture, system, and tools. Next generation is here, and you're on to the next generation. I mean, it's constantly changing. So you're moving from technology that's a supporting capability, and this is what I see in business continuity. A lot of times we talk about technology services supporting the rest of the organization, to where technology is seamlessly integrated and core to every aspect of the organization, and it's a means to unlock value and enable quick reactions to business and stakeholder needs. So now what you've seen is we have kind of combined those practices into 5 trademarks. And I'd like you to look and see which one of these trademarks is really the strongest or most mature in your organization. Where do you feel the strongest? So a few minutes ago, we looked at those practices. Now look at those 5 trademarks. Where do you feel that you're the strongest? Give you about 5 more seconds. All right. Let me share this with you. Not surprisingly, technology is about, in fact, I would have thought technology would have had the highest vote, but actually process and people are pretty much the same. And it also doesn't surprise me that structure is the lowest, because more than half of you said that you're more bureaucratic in your structure. So that's really interesting to see that was more evenly distributed between process, people, and technology. I'm really encouraged by that, because I was expecting to see low structure and everything else be technology. So I'm feeling encouraged by some of that. And again, if you have examples of how you're doing this at your organization, would love to hear from you. We're going to finish up here with a little bit about, why you're doing this. In other words, we talked about why it was important, but now we need to actually talk about why it pays to combine speed with stability. We showed this chart earlier, the health index. And when they actually did their study, what they found was, I mentioned earlier that an agile company would rank in the top quartile for organizational health at about 70%. But look at the trapped one. only 5% of, only 5% of companies that operate more like the trapped environment would be financially viable. And here you've got 17% for bureaucratic and 23% for startup. To me, this is a really interesting outcome. Now, because it's based on how healthy your organization is and how well that you are performing. They also went and looked at the top 10 practices. So we looked at those 18 practices, and then what they did is they looked at more agile organizations and they said, which practice are you the strongest in? And then they looked at least agile organizations and looked at that same ranking. Role clarity came out as number one. I found this really, really interesting, that people, when they understand their roles and responsibilities and are given the opportunity to perform them, that's a huge practice for being agile. And the outcome is that people are more accountable. Look at the rank, 35 for least. You've got top-down innovation, meaning that innovation is being driven by your leadership. We talked about the importance of your leadership team providing the structure for you to be able to do your work. And here this became as number 2, and the rank, the 37 for the least agile. We often talk, we need top management support. We're here at saying, when you have top management support and innovation being driven in agile organizations, it makes a difference. And it really helps with that associated outcome of innovation and learning. Also capturing external ideas. So many of these management system standards talk about the importance of looking at your external environment, and people just kind of slip by that. You need to understand your internal and external context and your internal and external environment. You need to understand who you are and how you operate internally, as well as who you are and how you interact with your external environment and what's happening outside your doors. And this, I think it's tied more than innovation and learning. I think it's also going to be tied to how well your organization operates. But having process-based capabilities, several of you thought that that was very important, that your organization was good at that. That's number 4. It leads to you to be more capable. Being operationally disciplined is number 5. Impacts your culture and your climate. Interesting, I thought that internally competitive was a practice that ranked number 6, and meaning that you're working with other teams and you're working within teams, but you're also being internally competitive, meaning that you're trying to perform well. And this goes back to, again, culture and climate. Having meaningful values, very tied to motivation and your culture and climate. Knowledge sharing, this is a big deal for organizational resilience. Knowledge sharing becomes one of the most important aspects. And if you're tying this to managing risk, if you're not sharing knowledge, I'm not sure what you're doing. It's very, very important. And this ties to innovation and learning. Having inspirational leaders, we all want to work for people who inspire us and work with people that inspire us. That's number 9, helps us to be more motivated. And I think it would also tie to culture. And having a people performance review versus your quote annual review, having this performance review be about how your team does and how your team responds. I will say though, if your team isn't doing very well and you can't really change teams, it can be a very frustrating experience for you. I have another daughter who actually is in sales and actually made less money because her team didn't perform to the same level that she had been performing on her own. And so now that she was part of a team, she actually made some less money. But they had to work on making their team more effective if the organization was going to be able to sell the way they're supposed to. So the question becomes, are you ready for Agile? This is not an easy process. And as you shared, some of you are already part of this process. But you need to embrace this magnitude of the change. It is going to change how you're doing business. And is your organization ready to make those changes? The biggest challenge is that misalignment between agile ways of working and those daily requirements of people's jobs. So it kind of goes back to that structure piece, where you've got a lack of collaboration across levels and units. And you've got employee resistance to change. Oh my gosh, I've been doing it this way for so long. Why do I have to do it differently? Agile transformations are most likely to succeed when they're supported by a comprehensive change management program and actions to help create that agile-friendly culture and agile-friendly mindset. It isn't something you just start doing without any preparation. You have to be really clear on the vision of why you're doing this. Agile units excel most when they're creating a shared vision and purpose, and they're aligning on this vision through actionable strategic guidance. In contrast, companies that haven't yet started a transformation, one of the most common limitations is this inability to create meaningful or a clearly communicated vision, getting everybody on board. And then you need to decide where and how to start. I mentioned earlier that a lot of organizations, pick an area to start with, and the most common area to pick is the technology area because that discipline is very tied to being agile. There's good processes in place and they've been in place for years. So if you haven't yet started, most people say it's because they lack a clear implementation plan. And here, remember, there's not a cookie cutter approach. So while the right plan will vary by company depending on its vision, companies should first identify the parts of the organization that they want to transform and how. In the end, McKinsey's done some writings about, okay, we've got these 18 things, but we're just going to say that if you don't do these 4 things, you're going to fail. These are the 4 most important, that you need to fail fast and learn from it. They really have a very interesting article about failing and being allowed to fail. And when you're talking about the culture of the organization, being allowed to fail and maybe being a way to fail in small contained ways so it doesn't hurt everybody, but then being able to learn from it and share that information is really, really important. And if you're not able to do that, it's going to be hard to be agile. So this is the number one, is being able to fail fast and learn from it, not fail big. And if you that's why if you're looking at this agile project management, for example, you're reviewing things in your scrums, and you're doing things much more often versus waiting till you get to the end. We talked about role clarity, reminding you that role clarity is not your job description. It's more understanding what you're accountable for, where you should be spending your time, what do you get to decide on your own, and what do you have to decide as part of a committee or larger group. We mentioned the importance of top-down innovation, that the decision makers who matter have agreed what the priorities are and how they're going to resource it. And it's really about as much about what you're going to do versus what you're not going to do. And this requires a really good external view about what's happening outside the organization as well. And then lastly, with these 4 is things need to be more project-based. If you're going to work in teams that are going to ramp up and then ramp down, you need to be project-based. There's a case study that I'd like you to take a look at. It's under agilebusinessmanifesto.com. And ING intentionally did this agile transformation across the entire organization versus starting small and growing it. And this could be an entire webinar all on its own, so I can't go into a lot of detail on it, but I really encourage you to not just read the article, but also there's some podcasts and some MP4 that they've put together that you can hear people talk about how they did this. But essentially, they put together 359-person squads, and these were considered multidisciplinary teams. And then they put those squads into 13 tribes, and these were squads with interconnected missions. They created chapters, and then they have product owners. You can see those are the people with the P's in their heads. They've got chapter leads, which are people with the stars in their heads. Then they have a tribe lead and then a coach. So this is a really, really interesting case study that I would encourage you to take a look at. So lastly, given what we've just learned here, would you consider agility as a factor when you're deciding whether or not to work for an organization? If you were trying to change jobs, would you be asking them about their agility initiatives? Is this something you want to be a part of, or is this something you'd rather stay away from, or you're not really sure? Because it's probably different than how you're currently working. And I have to say, being a mom of 4 people in their 20s, this is how they work. It's very, very interesting to see how they work. And so being someone who's not in their 20s, I have a lot to learn about what this might look like. And I think that I would, if I was going to change jobs ever in the future, I would be asking that question. So let's take a look. 72% of you said definitely, 22% of you said maybe, and 6% of you were really honest and said, I don't think so. I don't think I want to get into that. It's not how I work. And I think it's really important for you to know how it is you best work. And maybe you're in an industry that doesn't have a lot of change and you don't need to, and that's okay. But it's really important that you do understand how you best work as well. So there are a lot of references. You're going to see that the primary source for this webinar was McKinsey & Associates, so those are the links there. But also these additional 5 sources I thought were really interesting as well. If you have other sources that you think that we've missed here, I'd love to hear from them so that we can share them with others. Of course, we have to tell you a little bit that we are putting together, based on this information that we're collecting, we have put together a second path for certification that's competency-based, and an education program to go along with that, where we do talk about Agile a lot. And just to remind you that we have our webinar series ongoing. We haven't scheduled our November and December topics yet, but our next one will be very different than today's, building resilient communities, and our August one will be about high availability versus disaster recovery. Thank you very much for joining us today, and have a great week.